Hello mate and welcome back to Let's Code Season 6. In the last video we added the ability to use items, but what we're going to do in this video is actually add a visual display to our inventory, and we're going to add the ability to drop items from that inventory as well. So let's jump right into it. So the first thing I want to do is make some changes to our use item method from within the player class. And what I've done here is I've added some if statement to it. So we're now saying if not self.getInventory index.use self, then we are basically what we're saying here is each method that we call from within a class returns none if we don't have a return type. In other words, if I don't explicitly state return true, return false, or return a value in a method, it will automatically return a none value, which means that what we can do is we can check if that method completed properly, i.e. if it returns none, then we can proceed to remove the item from the inventory, which is what we've done here. So if we're saying if it's completed successfully, then we'll just pop the item from our index list and job's a good one. However, if it did not return none, then we will say blah, 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 it doesn't work like that. So we're saying we're returning a string to our message log that we created in the last episode that says whatever it is doesn't work like that, okay? So in this screen, this is a brand new screen called inventory screen, funnily enough. And what we're doing here is we have a box at the bottom of the screen in the middle, which is wide enough to fit 4 items, because if you remember, our inventory is only going to be 4 items long. And it simply shows the icon of the item as an image button, which if we click on it, then it will run as the code at the bottom. And we're gonna walk through this, so don't stress too much about what's happening. Okay, so we declare the name of the screen as inventory screen, and then we create a frame. The frame size is going to be 180 by 45. 180 is obviously 4 times 45. So it's going to be 4 blocks wide, 1 block tall. And then we're going to set its alignment to be in the middle of the screen at the very bottom. We've got a background color of 0009, which is a kind of 50% opacity black square. And then we're going to set the padding to be 0 because we want our items to fit perfectly inside that frame. Now we create a horizontal box. If you remember, the horizontal box sits inside the frame and it lines everything we put inside it horizontally. And then we have a loop. What we're going to do is loop through, and we've got count and inventory item in enumerate. So count is obviously going to be the index, and the inventory item is going to be the item itself or the object itself in the player's inventory. For each item in the player's inventory, within our HBox, we're going to create an image button. Its hover and idle icons will be the inventory items icon. And then the key sim is another way of saying that there is a keyboard shortcut activating this button as well as clicking on the button. And the button is going to be operated by the keyboard shortcut of the index +1. So if it's index 0, then button 1 will operate it. If it's index 1, button 2 will operate it. So it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4 rather than 0, 1, 2, 3, because that would be a little bit jarring for the player to have to go all the way across the keyboard to the 0 key in order to operate the item that's in the first inventory slot. And then it calls the function game.player use item, and then it sends the index through as a parameter. So if you remember from our use method, it required the index of the item. So that's what we're doing there. We're just calling that method that we've already defined, and we're passing the index as the count. So this will create, if we have a full inventory, 4 buttons, which will be operated by the clicking on them or using 1, 2, 3, and 4 keys, and it will use the item from the inventory screen. So that's more visual feedback to the player about what they've got in their inventory and the ability to use those items. Now, obviously, we need to add that item in the use statements in our main UI. So that's what I've done there. And you can add it. You can really put these in any order you want. Obviously, the background image has to be the first one you create. Otherwise, it will appear over the top of everything else. But the icon screen isn't going to interfere with the player HUD, which isn't going to interfere with the log, which isn't going to interfere with the inventory screen. So you can pretty much put those last 4 in whatever order you want. But I've just laid them out in the order that I've created them. So it's a little easier for you guys to see. Now you may be wondering, why am I showing the prefab XML file again? And as you can see, the bottom item is no longer health potion small. It is now called the shield of blocking. What's the shield of blocking, I hear you cry? Well, that's a very good question. I'm very glad you asked. Let's have a look. So far, all of our game items have been usable, whether it be food or drink or health potions, but we also want to be able to pick up armor and weapons and special items like that. But we don't want them to be able to be used. So we've created a new class called armor, and it's derived from the parent class of game object. And again, it goes through the same constructor as all of our previous game items. It calls the constructor with a name, amount, and an icon. And then it calls the super, as in the parent class's constructor, with name, amount, true, and icon. But in this case, the use method just returns true. In other words, the item can't be used. So this is, at the moment, not a fully fleshed out class, because there's going to be other things that we need to do to it. But for the time being, we just want items that we can pick up and that can't be used, and will sit in our inventory. And then later on, when we add the combat statistics side of this game, then armor and weapons will obviously add to our defense and damage output. But for the time being, we just want an item that can't be used. So that's what we've got here. And then, as you can see, we've got a class called Shield of Blocking, which derives from the armor parent class. And its constructor just pumps out the name, which is Shield of Blocking, the value of 10, and then the icon is going to be Shield 1. And if you remember, the icon file needs to be within the same folder as all the other game item icons. It needs to be a PNG 45 by 45 pixels is what I've set mine to. You can obviously change the values of those things if you want to. But now we have an item which operates exactly the same way as our health potion small, that we can identify, we can put into our XML file, and it will populate that item within the room that it's declared to be within. So that's pretty cool. And then, as I said, this item can't be used, so it's not going to disappear from the inventory if we accidentally click on the button for it. And because we've got a visual feedback for our inventory now, we also need to make sure that we can't pick up more than 4 items. So if you look here in our move player method from within the room class, we have now got an additional if statement at the bottom here that says if len player.getInventory is less than 4. In other words, if we've got 4 or more items in our inventory, the player can't pick up an object from the room. It will just remain an obstacle that we can't get past. So that's fine. But now I suppose what we really need to do is we need to start thinking about how are we actually going to drop items. If we've got 4 items in our inventory, yeah, if they're all potions, we could just use one. But what happens if we don't want to waste a potion if we've already got full hit points? We need to start looking into that. So within the player class, we're going to create a method called drop item, and it's going to take an index and it's going to take a room. And then we're going to say if not room.dropItem. Now, if you remember, what we're saying here is if the method has not completed. So the room class also has a drop item method that we're going to get to in a minute. And the room items drop item method is going to only take the item, the inventory item that we want to be dropped. And then if we have successfully completed that method, then we're going to add the message dropped, whatever it is, the item that we've dropped. And then we're going to remove it from the inventory using self.getInventory.pop and then the index. Okay, so nice and simple. However, if the method in the room class doesn't complete successfully, then we will say unable to drop here. And that's all that method does, nice and simple. So the room class's drop item method only takes one parameter in, and that is the item that it's dropping. And it's a bit of a misnomer this, because we're not actually dropping the item from the room class. All we're doing is we're spawning a copy of it, or we're spawning that item in a new location. So we're going to say the position to drop is going to be a random choice from within the empty spaces around the player's position. Now, if you remember, the room class already has a get empty spaces and a get player position methods within it, which is what this all means. We're just giving ourselves position to drop is going to be a tuple that we get from a random list, from the list, because get empty spaces returns a list of all of the free empty spaces around a given position, in this case, the player's position. So that's what that slightly complicated looking line there does. Now we're checking if the position to drop is not equal null. In other words, if there are any items in that list, because we might be stood in a position somehow where there are no empty spaces around us, in which case we can't drop the item. However, if that's not the case, if we have got a list of positions to drop and we've actually selected one of them, then we're just going to use the room methods, the room classes add item XY method to drop the item in the position. If it's not true, then we will return true back to the previous method. And if you remember, if we return true, that's our way of telling the method that called this method that the method did not complete properly. So we jump back to the previous method, which is in the player class, and it will just return feedback to the player saying, I can't drop this item. Now, to maintain encapsulation and to try and stop things from getting too convoluted, we don't want to keep going backwards and forwards through classes. What we're actually going to do is when we want to drop an item, we're actually going to call it from the game class. So this is a method that's within the game class. And as you can see, all we're doing is passing an index into this method. So we're going to say to the game, drop the item, whatever the index of that item is. It's then going to tell the player class, call your drop item method, and I'm going to pass you the information you need, which is going to be the index of the item, and I'm going to tell you what the current room is. Because if you remember, our player's drop item class requires an index, and it requires a room within which to drop it, so that it can then call the room's drop item class or method. So it's kind of a daisy chain effect, but this just means that we don't have to keep jumping backwards and forwards within classes. We just create a nice straight line from game class to player, from player to room, and then that operates as we want it to. Now we also need to make an adjustment to the room class's get empty spaces method, because we're now getting to the stage where if the player is stood up against one of the edges of the room, then the method that we had before would have returned an error, because it would have tried to look at a cell that was out of the index list, or out of the space basically. So what we have to do here is we now have to add some additional bits to our if statements. If you remember, our original if statement said if self.getMatrix y x minus 1 equals 0. But if the player had been on the left hand side of the screen, it would have tried to have searched for an index that didn't exist, and it would have thrown an error. So what we need to do is say if x is greater than or equal to 1, then we'll search this by saying fx is greater or equal to 1 and self.getMatrix. So it'll check the first condition, and if the first condition is correct, then it will move on to the second condition. That's why we have to put this at the start of the statement rather than at the end of the statement, because it would still throw an error otherwise. So we're saying if the player is not stood on the hard left of the screen and the space to the left of the player is 0, then list of possible cells.append. And then we do the same thing for the right hand side of the screen. We're saying if x is less than the length of the get matrix y and then -1. So if the player is stood to the left of the right hand side of the screen, then it can run the second condition, otherwise it won't. And then we do the same thing in the y direction. Y has to be greater than or equal to 1 to check the cell above it, and it has to be less than the size of the room in order for us to check the cell below it. And then that will stop this method from throwing an error and causing us headaches. And the last piece of the puzzle is to actually add some functionality to be able to drop an item. So what I've got here is in my loop in the inventory screen, I've added a new line. And what this line of code does is it creates a keyboard shortcut for the index number of the item +5 rather than +1. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 will use the items. 5, 6, 7, and 8 will drop the items. And as you can see, the action for that button is going to be game.dropItem, and it's just going to provide the index for the item we want to drop. And then that starts the daisy chain we created from the game class to the player class to the room class to drop that item. So again, remember, it's important that we set the count +5, just like we did the count +1 here. Otherwise, we're going to get conflicting things. If you was to accidentally put count +1 in here, then what the game would do, anyone can guess. It would run either or, wouldn't run both. You can't drop and use the item at the same time. That would be known as a duplication glitch. So yeah, we make sure that the button is the string is count +5, and then we'll have 5, 6, 7, and 8 will be our drop buttons. So putting it all together, we can whip up here and we'll grab this item, and you can see we've got it in our inventory. And if we go into the next room, we go and we can see that we've got our new shield item. We pick up 3 items, and then we can try and use the shield, and it says shield of blocking doesn't work like that. And we can try some dropping and using of items. There you go, we dropped the shield of blocking, went underneath it. We can use a potion, and we can drop a potion, and then we can go and pick them up again just to make sure that that functionality is still working. So as you can see, that's all functioning nicely. That is it for this video. Hopefully you followed along without too many troubles. You can see that all of the groundwork we've done in previous episodes is now starting to pay dividends, because everything we're doing now is taking much less time and we're getting much better results. So now we have the ability to walk around our map, traverse between rooms, pick up items, drop items, use items from within the inventory, and we have the ability to create prefabs. So we're pretty much at a stage now where if we didn't want any enemies in our game, we're at a stage where it could just be a pure exploration game where you walk around and pick up nice items or whatever. So we're already kind of getting to the stage where we've already got a fairly well fleshed out game, a dungeon exploration game. Now we just need to add some danger, which is what we're going to be looking at in forthcoming episodes. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one. But until then, you take damn good care of yourselves, all right? Bye-bye.